Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Emerald Planet. All the ecology news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's your host, Executive Director of the Emerald Planet, Dr. Sam Lee Hancock.
Hello and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you on a week-to-week basis from Washington, D.C. in the United States as we look around the globe in 144 different nations, looking for those 1,000 best practices, technology, services, and products that are making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And as we move through the 21st century, we'll be adding about 2 billion new people, yes, about 2 billion new people by 2050, and possibly by the end of this century, we'll be somewhere in 12 to 13 billion people. So how are we going to be able to take care of all these people when we're undergoing severe climate change? And I have someone sitting right beside me, a great Rotarian, and also she is a Director of Strategic Partnerships for ShelterBox USA. This is Sarah Robinson, and it's called ShelterBox USA Disaster Relief, and welcome to the Emerald Planet TV.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Sarah, glad to have you here, and we've been trying to get you on Emerald Planet TV for quite a while because this activity of ShelterBox, actually my Rotary Club a number of years ago, we were one of the early adopters of this, and a couple of the chairs came out of it, but it's just a fantastic program, but it's just booming because of everything that's going on around the globe. So tell us about the vision, the mission of ShelterBox USA, and let's get into why you really need this as we reach out around the globe.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that we do disaster relief, and we really are out to serve families on their worst day ever. So if floods strike, if bombs have attacked a community, if there are earthquakes that hit, we're there to support families either after natural disasters or conflicts. And so we're providing the emergency equipment and shelter that they need to be able to rebuild first their homes, but then their communities. Yeah,
looking at the slide we have here, this is what's in one of those shelter boxes, and it's amazing. I mean, the box is quite heavy. I've had to lift some of those, but it's amazing what's in there and how you can take people that have lost literally everything. I mean, there's nothing left, not even a pad where their house was before. And all of a sudden they have a place where they can sleep, they can cook, they can process, water and take care of their laundry, all these kinds of things go on in something it's very simple. So looking at ShelterBox USA and Rotary International, your collaborators, actually partners in this whole effort. So what is Rotary International, and then how does that directly relate back to ShelterBox USA?
Sure. So Rotary International is a service organization, and so they're community leaders who come together to do good not only in their community but really in the global community. And so there are 1.2 million Rotarians worldwide who are looking to make a difference and to put service above self. And so it was those Rotarians who actually started ShelterBox. There were a few Rotarians who were part of a club in England who had been part of the military and were on disaster scenes often. And what they found was that oftentimes food and medicine would come into a community following a disaster, but that there wasn't a great temporary housing solution. And so being Rotarians, they saw a problem and wanted to solve it. And so they came up with this relatively simple concept of putting everything a family would need to survive after a disaster into a box and then getting it to where it's needed the most.
Yeah, when you look at the map of the world and you see these green areas where ShelterBox has been, there's really not many places that you can't find here, because it's not just into developing countries, but it's in developed countries as well. If people have need or they've lost everything, you try to help. So you're even doing things within the borders of the United States, which is somewhat unusual for such a charity, but reaching out to the globe. So how many different countries are you now reaching, and maybe the number of people that are being reached?
Sure. So since we started in 2000, we've been in 100 countries and served 1.3 million people during that time. But one of the things I think is important to remember is that behind those numbers are families and stories. So one that comes to mind is a gentleman who we helped named Hassan, and he's in Aleppo, and he was actually paralyzed after he came down with a fever one night and went to his local pharmacy. The health care has declined so much in Syria that many of the doctors have fled, and so people are taking low-cost care. So he went to a pharmacy. They essentially gave him the wrong injection, which which paralyzed him. And so now he has his 7-year-old son going out and working 6 days a week to try to raise income for their family. And so it's families like that who are left with very few options. It's really the most vulnerable who we're targeting with our support.
Yeah, and the whole thing about this too is when you look at it, the people that, I mean, they really are in dire need because they've lost literally absolutely everything. And but you look at these faces, you look at the surroundings, I mean, it's so different, you know, having 100 countries, and the need that you're reaching out to is absolutely incredible. So we talked about Syria as one of those. What are, say, a couple other countries that you've been involved with that something that really stands out in your mind, how to reach out and help these people?
Sure. Well, a very large-scale response for us was in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake struck. 1 million people were displaced at the time, and ShelterBox provided a third of the tented shelter in the country. And so, you know, just seeing the absolute devastation of a nation was something that drove so many of us to act. And so we actually returned there in 2016 after Hurricane Matthew and were able to provide support yet again. But our aid had evolved to where, rather than putting people in tents, we actually offered a lot of the families what we call shelter kits. So they were tarps and tools that people could use to repair their home. So if a roof was torn off in a hurricane, they could just repair their existing structure and be able to stay on their home site with their family and with their belongings. Right now, we are operating in 12 different countries at the moment, and it's everything from some of the areas affected by disaster like Kenya, where 300,000 people have been displaced with flooding, to some of those conflict zones like the Lake Chad Basin, which has actually been called the Forgotten Crisis because the families fleeing Boko Haram violence there have, you know, now fled out of Nigeria and into Niger and Chad and Cameroon. And so we've been working in different areas of those countries for years now.
Yeah, and I know that because of the malaria work that we're doing, there's 3.3 million internally displaced people, IDPs, within Nigeria because of Boko Haram. But the whole thing about this, when you listen to the generals at the Pentagon, you listen to most of the leading scientists, they're saying that really most of this is actually nature and environmental related, climate change, because many places are just flat running out of water. They don't have any water, so they're having to, you know, move. So again, internally displaced people. And then, you know, the incidents as far as, you know, earthquakes, now volcanoes are adding to, you know, the mayhem around the globe. And of course, all the things are happening of what they call cloud bombs, you know, this incessant rain that's coming down and destroying things. So people really are, it's almost like they're environmental refugees all over the world. So when you're looking at that, how is ShelterBox really going to be able to keep up with this? 1.2 million, but there's 66 million people displaced on the planet right now. That's a huge number, most since World War II.
You're exactly right. And so we're really growing and scaling to be able to meet that increasing need. So we actually have a goal at ShelterBox, and that's by the year 2025, we're going to be serving 1 million people annually. And so, you know, when you think about us having done that in 17 years, we want to get to the point where that's the number we're able to help every year, but it's because the need is so incredible. You mentioned the current statistics, and by the year 2050, it's estimated that 200 million people will be displaced. And so we feel an absolute urgency to be able to serve more of those families. And so working with partner organizations is one of the ways we're going to be able to do that, looking at our supply chain logistics, finding out how we can produce more low-cost equipment that we can use to serve more families. The shelter kit's a perfect example of that, whereas our traditional box cost $1,000, those kits are $100. So
my goodness, one was $1,000, now you're down to $100.
So we're able to help.
And that's 10 times more families.
Yeah, exactly, just that.
Incredible. And also you're using the local resources they have. So if part of a house or most of a house, or they take 2 houses and make one, put this temporary roof on, then you got 2 families, but at least they're going on with their lives within their same communities. And I think that's something important. I think that's what you're doing, just like what we're seeing here, is to allow people to be served in place if at all possible, instead of having to travel hundreds of miles and even go into different countries, different languages. They don't have schooling and all these other types of things. So what are the 2 or 3 main things that you've learned from your experiences that would be considered best practices to address these internally displaced persons, you know, refugees of any kind, and how do we move forward from there? there with these best practices that you've learned?
Sure. So I would say that, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. That's probably our biggest takeaway since we began. So rather than always giving the same box of gear, we've really changed and evolved to where we're going in and we're finding out what that family needs, what the particular climate calls for, what types of local building resources are available, and then we're designing our aid response to fit what's already there on the ground. And then I would say also, being able to take the lessons we've learned from natural disasters and to apply those to the world's conflict zones has really allowed us to expand and to serve more people. And there is just such an immense need now.
Mm-hmm. Going back on this photograph of this young lady, carrying this, so this is a little different than the shelter box that we've seen earlier. But again, it allows mobility, allows them to have this in instantly. And then we go to this where you have their traditional shelter boxes and they're taking these up on, into the high mountains. I mean, it's just amazing how you're moving all these things. And I know you're using helicopters and ships, canoes, all these other kinds of things. So looking at this, reaching out to communities, how many different ways are you able to reach these people, and how are the local governments, when I say local governments, either national, regional, or state within a different government, actually is helping and assisting both ShelterBox USA and Rotary International to do this kind of disaster relief?
Sure. So often it's the network of Rotarians around the world who are helping us to connect with those government officials, to get our aid through customs more rapidly, to find places to store our equipment and means of transportation. They're really critical partners in the work that we do. And we really get the equipment there any way possible. So sometimes the airport has been destroyed in the natural disaster, and so we're bringing our gear in on ships. As you mentioned, sometimes it's on the back of donkeys or in wheelbarrows or on bicycles.
Or the helicopter we're looking at right here.
Exactly. The Dutch Navy, I know, gave their ship during that Hurricane Matthew that I mentioned so that we could transport our aid that way. So it's really using a combination of whatever is available to us at the time. And it's important because it allows us to reach last mile communities that would otherwise go unserved. So after there were earthquakes in Nepal, many of the large organizations landed in Kathmandu in the capital and were distributing aid, but we were actually hiking our boxes out into mountain villages whose roads had been washed out by the landslides and who were really otherwise cut off from the world.
Yeah. Now looking at this, last question, we got to do it quick. What do you see for the growth and development of ShelterBox International, Rotary International in this whole thing over the next, say, 5, 10, 15 years?
Sure. Together we're just going to grow and scale so that we can meet that increasing need. We're really targeting the most vulnerable families, and we want to be able to serve more of them.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. Sarah Robinson, she's a Director of Strategic Partnerships for ShelterBox USA, which is related to Rotary International. Very important to put that in there, disaster relief. And it's just incredible, Sarah, what you're doing, how you're reaching out to all around the globe. Thank you for being with us as we create the Emerald Planet.
How do you know? No cages, no crates, no tie stalls, no painful living conditions. How do you know? No hormones or antibiotics in feed. How can you know? Your choice is wholesome and humane. Did you know choosing natural foods raised in humane conditions promotes farm animal well-being as well as yours and your family? Choose Certified Humane. Certified Humane certification and labeling program assures customers that when they purchase products with the Certified Humane logo, those animals were raised healthy and humanely. When you choose Certified Humane, everyone benefits. For more information about Certified Humane and its benefits to animals, farmers, and consumers, visit their website at www.certifiedhumane.org. That's www.certifiedhumane.org.
Taking care of a family member can lead to plenty of questions. Fortunately, there's a place to get the answers, for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Imagine a time when no one person has Parkinson's disease, is debilitated by a stroke, and no family suffers the tragedy of Alzheimer's. Some of the best minds in America are doing more than imagining. The American Brain Foundation is seeking to find cures, where life without brain disease isn't just something we can imagine.
We're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you from Washington, D.C. and we're looking for those 1,000 best practices, what we call the best of the best, the solutions that are being used around the globe to bring humanitarian aid to people, to address the environment and climate change, to provide new education, health care, roads, all the basic infrastructure, all the things that we need for a planet that's going to be about 9 billion people by 2050, maybe 12 to 13 billion by the end of the century. And so we're looking at ways to reach out to people to help them in need. And of course, with severe climate change, we're finding that there's just drastic changes going on all over the world. Places that one time that could flourish because of high rainfall now may have none. Monsoons have gone from 6 and 7 months down to 2 and 3 months. Other places where they had little rain in the past, actually they're getting torrential rainfall. And so the weather patterns and the climate just seems to mix all over the world. But we have a gentleman that's joining us, and I have a lady sitting right next to me that are really looking out after those that are most vulnerable around the globe. Well, we're going to be introducing Bill Woodard. He is a member, board of directors, and response team member of ShelterBox USA. He's coming in by Skype. And then we have our special guest sitting right in the studio with me. This is Sarah Robinson. She's Director of Strategic Partnerships for ShelterBox USA, Disaster Relief. And Sarah, welcome for being in the studio. And Bill, I think you're here by Skype. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And I've seen your photograph many times as it relates to ShelterBox USA. And I must say you're doing really excellent work. And thank you on behalf, as a Rotarian myself, thank you on the work that you're doing. What's your understanding about the purpose and efforts of ShelterBox USA and also the collaborative relationship that ShelterBox has with Rotary International?
Well, ShelterBox, again, is direct related to International and the Rotary organization. It was founded by a Rotary Club in the year 2000. And by the year 2013, we had actually become the first project partner of Rotary International. And today, we work very closely with Rotary. My last deployment was in the Caribbean. I went in on the first team, and we were in daily communication with Rotary International, as well as with Rotary clubs on the ground. I worked with the Rotary Club of Antigua Barbuda, and I also worked with the Rotary Club of Road Town in the British Virgin Islands. And in each case, their partnership is what allowed us to be so effective on the ground.
Boxes. We had the photograph of you with the shelter box surrounded the various sizes of these, and of course this is the contents of that. Why is the shelter box so important? I won't get to how you got involved, but why is this so important? I mean, you got a mix of different things here, but how did this come into being as far as the mix of items that are provided to these families that in essence have lost everything?
Very good question. The original concept came about as a result of a gentleman by the name of Tom Henderson just saying, what would I need for my family if a disaster struck in Cornwall? And from that, the box got fleshed out to include all of the non-food items a family needs for their survival. So obviously the shelter in the tent is what it's built around, but safe water. We've got a very robust water filter. We've got blankets, we've got ground covers. We've got solar lighting, which is so critical to a family's well-being. And we also have the tools for recovery. And these are high quality products in each case. That made up the shelter box. But from there, the shelter box has really evolved to become a number of individual components that oftentimes today are what we're using. As an example, this past summer in Pakistan, it was water filters. In some deployments, it's just been tarps. Other deployments, it's just been tents. Again, what the community identifies as having the most need as it relates to the shelter component is what we're all about.
And this really is an evolution from the if we classical think of the shelter box to where you have these tarps, and we'll have a couple of photographs of this and the importance of that, because many people are in structures but they need something to keep the rain off, and so that's very important, and we're showing those visualizations, Bill, that you shared with us. But how did you become involved directly with Shelter Box?
Well, it was a very serendipitous journey. I had retired and started traveling with a backpack and my two children into some pretty exciting and adventurous parts of the world. We ended up on several occasions in communities that were just a shock, very honestly, to me in terms of the conditions people were living in and the circumstances that they were being faced with. And I quickly became conscious of the fact that I needed to do something to respond to this. I had been very much involved in my working career with United Way as a volunteer. I had actually been a United Way volunteer campaign chairman in a community that I had lived in. And I had some very strong points of view about what and how I might get involved. First of all, I wanted an organization that provided dignity to the beneficiary. The beneficiary felt better about themselves and their circumstances after they had received the aid. I also wanted an organization that provided impeccable fiduciary responsibility. In a nutshell, the beneficiary ended up getting the bulk of the dollar that the donor had donated. And with those two criteria, I set out to look for an organization that met those requirements. It took nearly a year for me to find a Shelter Box, but I must tell you, that's been 6 years ago now, and a deployment and a intervention or a day doesn't go by that I do not thank my lucky stars that I found such a competent and capable organization.
Absolutely fantastic, and you know, Rotary International is an important part of that, and we're glad to have you part of both those, both as far as Shelter Box USA and Rotary International. And Sarah, you have the next question.
I do. So Bill, Shelter Box has been called an innovative charity. Can you speak some more about what that means and how, as we move forward, it will help us as we experience advancing climate change, and how Shelter Box and Rotary might come together to implement these innovative solutions?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Innovation. We've really learned a very valuable lesson in the field, and that is you go to the community to get their insight as to what they believe the solution should be. And with that, then you try and tailor something to work for them. Our innovation has really come about as a result of that mindset. We've developed different programs, again, to use specific equipment, tarps, as an example. The shelter kit, which gets used today, as a matter of fact. Let me just step back. This past year, just 6% of the aid that Shelter Box provided was in the form of a shelter box. The balance of it was in tarps, shelter kits, United Nations tents, Shelter Box tents, and the like. And as we work with these in the community, we're very conscious of the fact that if we're going to evolve, we really need to go back to the recipients and better understand how they use the equipment and if it in fact met their needs. And so with each deployment, we do a monitor and evaluation generally about 6 months after we've done the initial distribution. And we learn what worked, what didn't work. From that, our equipment evolves.
And looking at these various images that you've shared and came from Sarah, it's just amazing the diversity that you're actually using in communities. And when you look at the destruction that you have in many of these areas, I mean, some areas there's absolutely nothing left, and others you have the basic structure. So I can see why you're using the tarps, the shelter areas, and then also as far as the shelter box themselves. But looking at how you work with partners, how do you bring in new partners that have the same values as far as the mission and vision? And Mauricio from Sterling, Virginia is asking that particular question. And thank you, Mauricio, for sharing that.
Yes, working with partners. We learned a very valuable lesson in 2010 in Haiti, where 1 million people lost their homes. ShelterBox provided shelter for nearly 300,000 of those individuals. And in 2016, the end of 2016, I was back in Haiti responding to Hurricane Matthew. And what we found was 100,000 of those families were still living in the equipment that we had provided. They were living in that equipment for all kinds of reasons, but the bottom line was that we had not taken the second step to ensure that there was a process for them to move forward. And that process today is done through partners. Rotary is a huge partner in that regard. In the Western Hemisphere, we use Habitat for Humanity a lot. Worldwide, International Federation of Red Cross, International Organization for Migration. These are each key partners that take that family, once we put that family in an emergency shelter situation, take that family to the next step to where they can get into permanent shelter.
And so Bill, we're running out of time. I want to ask you a question. What do you see for the expansion of ShelterBox and working with Rotary International, say over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and we've got about 20 seconds to do that?
Okay, first of all, partnership gets stronger and stronger by the day, and that is going to be a big piece of our success. Rotary clubs are the silver bullet we have on the ground to get things done quickly, and Rotary International is the umbrella that we have the opportunity to work under.
And a response team member for ShelterBox USA. Sarah Robinson, Director of Strategic Partnerships for ShelterBox, is sitting right beside me. And thank you. As we see these images of people that are trying to rebuild their lives, working through ShelterBox to do that, as we create the Emerald Planet.
Take a look under your bed. Find stuff under there? What about jobs? No? Now try your closet. Still no jobs? Just more stuff? Well, you really have both. See, stuff is defined as household articles considered as a group. Sometimes this stuff is no longer needed. Wait, no longer needed? That can't be right. Because remember those jobs you were looking for? Those are really needed. And they're the stuff inside your stuff. Our job is to unlock those jobs. And it starts when you donate your stuff to your local Goodwill. Here's how we do it. When you donate to Goodwill, we sell your stuff to provide job training for people right here in your community. So just by teaming up with Goodwill, you help create jobs. And isn't that worth parting with the leftover keytar from your 80s cover band? Goodwill. Donate stuff, create jobs.
We just finished dinner and it was time for homework. He hates homework. I know he's bright.
Why is it so hard for me?
He's just
trying
gotta
as
try a
hard
little
as
harder.
I can.
1 in 5 children struggle with learning and attention issues. Go from misunderstanding to understood.org.
It's me, Artie. Come see what I collected from the Creative Galaxy in my idea box.
Transform your world.
Will you help me make art?
Before you throw it away,
Hey, I have an idea.
think outside the box.
Go be amazing!
Give your cardboard box another life. Recycle.
Most party fouls? Not a big deal. But if you decide to drink and drive underage, you could lose your license and your freedom. Underage drinking and driving, the ultimate party foul.
We're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello, welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you, as you know, on a week-to-week basis from Washington, D.C. in the United States. We're looking for those 1,000 best practices, the things that are making a real difference in the lives of people. And we're not always talking about, and actually we very seldom ever talk about just the problems or the challenges that people are having. We're talking about solutions which are really taking care of the challenges and the problems that people do have, but in very practical ways. And sometimes these are coming from think tanks and universities and many other such institutions. Other times they're coming from humanitarian groups and nonprofit organizations or NGOs. And we're talking with and about two of those right now. One is called ShelterBox USA, but it really is ShelterBox Worldwide, and the other is Rotary International. And we're looking at people that are either internally displaced or internationally displaced because of natural disasters or what we call human-made disasters, because of severe climate change, and many of these really are in environmental refugees, more so than maybe by war, famine, which in most cases is caused by what's happening with the environment itself. And we have someone who is quite unique in a background, who is a writer, looking at the work that's going on with both ShelterBox USA and Rotary International. This is Yi-Shin Lai. She is a member, board of directors, and what's called a response team member of ShelterBox USA, and she's coming in by Skype. And then we have our good friend and longtime colleague. This is Sarah Robinson. She's what we call our special guest that's here in the studio. She's a director of strategic partnerships of ShelterBox USA, and it's always good to have you here. And she's a very active Rotarian. And Yi-Shin, welcome to the Emerald Planet TV. Okay, they're going to put up your mic there. And anyway, thank you for being with us. And I've looked at some of these photographs that you've shared with us. These are absolutely incredible. And what is the how and why as far as humanitarian work? And I think we have an issue going on. So Sarah, what is some of the how and why as far as ShelterBox itself is concerned? And why is it so important?
Sure. It's so important that we're able to deliver aid rapidly, because oftentimes, you know, aid organizations will come in and offer more of a long-term solution, but being able to really fit the gap that's right after a disaster, immediately following a disaster, and to get on the ground with urgency, and to be able in those early days to be on the ground. Right now we're in Guatemala, for example. As soon as we found out the volcano had erupted there, we had a team packing their bags and headed that way. I saw a video on our Facebook page today of them flying over in a helicopter where the volcano had erupted, with the local Rotary International director, as they worked together to really assess the extent of the damage so that they could start to make a plan for helping families who need it most.
You know, and the whole thing about Rotary International, and I say this somewhat kiddingly, but really it's almost true. I mean, Rotary International itself is really larger than many countries as far as its outreach and the impact that it's having. You know, when you say it's 1.2, maybe up to 1.4 million members, 34,000 clubs, almost 190 different countries. I mean, that's a huge footprint that Rotary has all over the world. So we're going to bring Yi-Shin back in. And Yi-Shin, welcome again to Emerald Planet TV. We're glad to have you here. You're a writer as a background, and we don't get many writers that are actively involved in a lot of these outreach and the disaster relief program. So why is a writer very interested in being involved in ShelterBox USA?
Well, I'll turn that question on its ear and note that we really only read for two reasons. The first is to get to know someone new, and the second is to feel not so alone. And I think as a writer, it's very important for us to continue to broaden our horizons so that we can tell the stories of the people that we meet on a daily basis. And certainly being involved in disaster relief allows us to meet so many more people around the world, and that contributes to our overall knowledge as humankind.
Yeah, and looking at all that, you've been involved. I mean, you're very actively involved, and we have the slides that hopefully will come up soon. But once you got involved, why you want to stay involved in that? And you've been encouraging other writers and other media people to become actively involved as well. Why do that?
Well, I do think that everybody, regardless of their background, should find their own shelter box, right? I mean, I'm certainly very passionate about this organization, but it isn't something that I would prescribe for everybody. There are lots of different ways to get involved in your community and otherwise, but writers in particular are very good at, of course, telling stories. However, we also provide the unique capability to be great listeners. And I think for people who have just been through the worst days of their lives and who are struggling to put their lives back together, this is a really wonderful encounter to have, right? To have with somebody who can be there to relay their stories and ensure that the rest of the world hears that story so that we can all be aware that someone around the world is in need of help.
Sarah, I think you have the next question.
I do. So as a writer, Ishan, are there stories that you'd like to take and share from your deployments or something that stands out in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I've deployed 11 times now for ShelterBox, and tomorrow I'll actually be heading off on my 12th deployment. I think that one of the things that I always note on a ShelterBox deployment is how incredibly close a community becomes in the days and weeks after disaster. And that kind of change has the capability to affect a community in very long-term fashion down the road. I know in the Philippines, for instance, we met a woman named Jinky who just appeared close to us one day and spent a couple of days guiding us around. And she ended up being a really critical part of that disaster relief framework for us. And the same is true of other places too. When I was in Haiti, I've deployed to Haiti now 3 times. And each one of those 3 times, I was able to meet and encounter community members who stepped up and out of their normal roles in life to be able to help their community. So those are some things that I recall off the top of my head.
What would be, you've been on several deployments, what would be the 2 or 3 things that you really learned on these deployments that have been carried over, to other communities you're becoming involved in, but also how has that really been impactful as far as your writing experience in a way that you're now framing your stories that may be a little different than before you became involved with ShelterBox and going on these overseas deployments?
Well, I think as writers, we work really hard to try and tell the story to the best of our capability. But in a lot of ways, we have to be very careful to not rob someone else of their agency to tell that story, right? We're in the unique situation of providing a little bit of reportage so that other people around the world have the capability to witness someone else's suffering and to be aware that really we're not all that different. So in terms of takeaways that I have, I think for me, it's most important to remember that at the base of it all, there is this sort of universal thread of a desire to help and a need to be a part of a greater thing that we all need to address and pay attention to every once in a while. But I also think it's important to provide the people who are going through these terrible situations with a methodology by which they can tell their own story. So that's part of what we do at ShelterBox, is ensuring that these people have a methodology to do that.
Yeah, and looking at the photograph we have here, this is on the ground. You're talking with one of the local people. And when you're talking with other writers, what do you share with them as far as how they can benefit, not just by humanitarian aid and reaching into a home that has a real need, but how they can really empower and enrich themselves by being involved with ShelterBox and having this meeting that you're having, this levity going on right here in this fantastic photograph. I mean, it's just absolutely wonderful.
For me, I think it's most important, once again, to broaden our horizons as people. It's very easy for us to get tunnel vision, living in the world that we live in and becoming not fully aware of the idea that there is this broader world out there with all these different people that we have yet to meet. We really are all very young when it comes to our breadth of experience, right? It can be hard to travel overseas. I consider myself lucky to have had the opportunity to do so. But in general, if you can find some way to meet somebody who isn't living your life, then that is beneficial to you all the way around, and maybe will be beneficial to your community as well.
That's absolutely fantastic. Sarah, I think you have another question.
Ishan, you're headed to Dominica on a deployment later this week. What are you headed there for?
Oh, this is something that I'm so proud of that we do at ShelterBox. We embark on regular monitoring and evaluation deployment, whereby we look really hard at the outcomes that we have to play with, and we look really hard at the actual effects that we've had on a community. So what I'll be doing is going back to the community that I deployed to back in November when we were in the midst of trying to deploy aid for Hurricanes Maria and Irma, and we'll be visiting those families to see whether or not our aid had the impact that we wanted it to have. In this case, we're specifically looking for whether or not we had the capability to help a community to prepare better for the next disaster. Hurricane season is literally starting right now. It started in June. It will run all the way through November. So we're hoping to go back there and see whether or not these families are now better prepared for the hurricane season coming up. And we do this with a number of different deployments. Every time we go out, we go back 3 to 4 months, 6 months after the disaster and after our response to ensure that our aid has had the effect that we want it to have. And we use that research and that data to learn from so that we can always be improving and always be pivoting our responses to ensure that we're doing the best we can by the families who need us.
That's fantastic. And the work you're doing both by the deployment, during the disaster and then going back and doing the evaluation afterwards, sometimes that's actually equally or even more important, because then you really have a broad swath and so many more people can benefit from what you're doing. We're just about out of time, but what do you see for the expansion and growth as far as ShelterBox itself, but involving other writers and other people of the media to come in and be integral to this process and to help people and not just be reporters or just saying what's happening on the ground?
Right. There is a real sense, I think, of community to be gained from all of this. It is critical for us to continue to tell each other's stories, whether that's as a witness to some of the suffering that goes on around the world, or it's as a conduit by which people can gain more human experience. That's something that I do believe everybody should seek out.
Yeah, and we're just going through this. We're going to leave this up. But anyway, thank you for being with us. It was fantastic.
My
you
pleasure.
Shared your story with us. Yishin Lai, she is a member, Board of Directors, Response Team member as far as ShelterBox USA. Sitting right beside us is our good Rotarian colleague and friend, Sarah Robinson, Director of Strategic Partnerships. Thank you for being with us as we create the Emerald Planet.
Guess what? I have some news for you. There's free food right there, junk food. You see that truck? Oh, jeez. It's a 2 Michelin star chef. All for free, ladies and gentlemen. All for free.
Here we have a panzanella with summer vegetables and pesto. Enjoy. How we doing?
Fantastic. So what do you got going on underneath that plate there?
This food is really about to be thrown away.
Yeah.
Bro?
Seriously?
Is there something wrong with this food? Where did you get it from?
From farmers markets. They put aside the ugly vegetables and the ugly fruits.
Carrot top, soft avocados. It was all food that was going to be discarded.
Even the drink you had is made from like a little bruised peach. Did it taste a little bruised?
Great. It was good.
The average person throws away 24 pounds of food a month. That's a lot. Isn't that a lot? Go visit SaveTheFood.com for more information. Thank you. Junk food time!
To the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock. I'm coming to you on a week-to-week basis from Washington, D.C. in the United States. I'm the President and Executive Director of Emerald Planet and the Emerald Planet TV. And we come to you to bring you the best solutions that can be found in 144 different nations. And actually, we really are reaching around the whole globe as far as looking for those practical decisions and those practical solutions that can be used to better people's lives that are through disasters, or people that are living their day-to-day life and they want to better themselves for not only their own families, but for their communities, their region, and their country. And we have a gentleman who has a very lofty title. We're going to introduce him here in just a minute, but this is Eric Elsey, and his title is Ambassador, like this, for ShelterBox USA. He's coming in by Skype. And right beside me is my good special guest, Rotarian, Sarah Robinson. She's the Director of Strategic Partnerships for ShelterBox USA. Thank you for being with us and having you here. And Eric, I think you're here coming in by Skype, correct?
I am, Doctor, and I'm excited to be on the program, so thank you for having me.
I just love this title as Ambassador for ShelterBox USA. Not many people get to be ambassadors, so you must be very special. So tell us a little bit about, what you're doing and how your canoeing and Ironman and all these other activities makes you an ambassador for ShelterBox and by extension for Rotary International.
Well, we could always use ambassadors. So I'm a volunteer for ShelterBox, but my responsibility is to go out and raise awareness about ShelterBox and let people know all the good work that we do around the globe, and also obviously raise funds for the organization. So one of the unique ways that I think doing that is this summer I'm going to be canoeing the entire from Lake Itasca to the Gulf of Mexico. And along the way, I'm going to spread the word about ShelterBox, both to Rotary clubs and other organizations during my trip through events, meetings.
Eric, and it's 2,552 miles. And tell us why you selected the fact that you're going to take a certain period of time to go down the Mississippi River. Tell us the relationship to what you're doing to the environment and why that's very important.
So this has been my lifelong dream. I don't even remember how long ago it was, but I've always wanted to canoe the entire Mississippi River. And scientists say that it takes 90 days for a drop of rainwater to go from Lake Itasca and make its way 2,552 miles all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And as you know, water quality and sanitation are so important after a disaster. In a lot of cases, as much death and disease and things are caused after the event than the actual event itself. So we're using that 90 days to tie in with water quality and how important that is after a disaster.
Now, looking at ShelterBox, this is a large, dynamic organization. Of course, it's part and partner with Rotary International, which is absolutely huge as an organization. It covers literally the whole globe, 34,000 clubs, almost 190 countries, and 1.2, 3 or 4 million people. So why be involved, at that level as an ambassador for this? And how does that give you outreach to what you do and what you like to do that you would not have otherwise?
Well, I absolutely love Rotary International. I'm currently the president of the Rotary Club of Cape Coral. I found ShelterBox actually through Rotary. And as you know, being a Rotarian, there's so many opportunities to get involved in the world because of that organization. And most people find their passion or have what they call their Rotary moment. And I had my Rotary moment years ago when I found out about the mission of ShelterBox and how they respond rapidly after disasters and help people on their worst day ever. And it just moved something in me. And I knew that I needed to get involved with this organization, as well as, you know, continue my service with Rotary. And it's been one of the best experiences of my life.
That's absolutely fantastic. And what a testimonial, Eric. And thank you for sharing it. Sarah, I think you have the next question.
I do. So Eric, I know you've been preparing for your epic adventure. How do you actually get ready for a trip like this? And is there such thing as accident proofing this type of journey?
Well, there's not. But so if you look up the definition of the word expedition, it implies a group. And even though I will be paddling this trip solo, I have an entire team, mostly ShelterBox ambassadors. I want to give a special shout out to Holly Anderson, who's an ambassador from North Dakota, and Greg Krauska, who's actually a ShelterBox board of director. We've got a whole team that have helped put this together, both lining up events and organizing. The amount of planning that's gone into this trip has been unbelievable, and I couldn't have done it without those two, and I want to give a thanks to them.
And also, too, what you're going to find is all the Rotarians along your trip are going to be out there cheering you on, but also actively involved. And one of the things I notice about Rotarians, doesn't matter what they do in life, they're very influential, but they're very hands-on. And I think that's what you're showing, Eric, through this expedition that you're doing. But going to climate change and the environment and all that, as you're paddling around with your canoe, what are you seeing and what are people sharing with you about the changes either in the weather patterns, the actual local environment itself, and how do you think that's impacting as far as the demand for more and more services through ShelterBox International and Rotary International itself?
Well, it's a great question and that you brought this up, and I haven't experienced this quite yet on my trip, but I'm reading a book currently called The River We Wrought, the history of the upper Mississippi River, and it talks about the history and reasons and debates over changing the river and how it's changed ecosystems. A lot of people don't realize this, but this is the 25-year anniversary of the Great Flood of '93 that was the most devastating flood that the United States ever experienced. Some estimates have it between $15 and $20 billion worth of property damage. Some estimates have upwards of 50 people losing their lives. And flooding is one of the disasters that ShelterBox responds to most often, even though it doesn't necessarily make the huge headlines like an earthquake in Haiti or the Indian Ocean tsunami. We deploy to floods constantly. And this being the 25-year anniversary, myself being basically a native of the St. Louis area, I spent a big chunk of my summer that year sandbagging the levees of the Mississippi, trying to prevent flooding. The town right next to the town that I was born and raised in, I'm from Waterloo, Illinois. The town next to us is Valmeyer, Illinois. It was completely wiped off the map. They had to relocate the entire city up onto the bluff to keep it out of harm's way in the future. And most of that, again, according to that book, is human-caused, man-made. It's a man-made disaster that people want to call a natural disaster, and that's because of what we've done to the river over our history.
About it, most of the things that we're suffering right now as far as climate change, and we blame the higher powers, we blame nature for it, but they're saying probably 90-95% of that it really is all human caused. And so we need to be very serious about protecting the environment and trying to reverse climate change. And that's what you're all about. what Sarah and the Rotarians are about as all over the globe. But what is special about ShelterBox itself as an organization that really struck your fancy, but now it's really captured your attention, your energy, the 3 T's, time, treasure, and effort. And so how does ShelterBox shape, in many ways, your life?
The first time that you meet a beneficiary of our disaster, our life-saving equipment, somebody who's actually received this aid on their worst day ever, it's going to move you. It'll move anybody. And I've had that experience many times, and it makes me understand that the work that I'm doing here to raise awareness about this organization is so critical, because the more we raise awareness, the more money we raise, the more good that we can do around the world. Like you brought up 60-something million people. I've had figures of 85 million people that are currently displaced. We're just touching a tip of the iceberg here. There's so much more need in this world, and we're poised to be able to provide that. We just need more help.
Yeah, and the whole thing about it too, we talk about the millions, just talking about Nigeria a little earlier, is almost 3.6 million internally displaced in Nigeria, and then you look across, the swath of Africa, as far as many of the areas that literally are just drying out, and so you're moving entire communities, all of their cattle, their children, everything is moving. It's just amazing. Sarah, I think you have the...
Yes, so Eric, in learning so much and preparing for this trip, are there any best practices or tips you would share with communities around getting themselves ready and preparing for a disaster?
Well, what I've done for the Mississippi expedition for ShelterBox is prepare, prepare, prepare. People always think that it can't happen to them. You see the stories on the news of faraway villages or volcanoes in Guatemala. I've actually stayed at the foot of that volcano or close to it 2 different times in the last 3 years. I could have easily been by that volcano, or it could have gone off when I was there. But just always be prepared. I own 3 tents, not including the ShelterBox tent I've got in my garage. So you just always have to be prepared. I'm from Florida. We've got Luminade solar lights, which we also put in our shelter boxes. You want to have foods stored that because you might be out of electricity for 5 or 6 days after an event. So just always be prepared. Don't think that it can't happen to you, that it's just some faraway place on the news, because it can happen right in your hometown.
Eric, we've absolutely running out of time. You got about 30 seconds. What do you see for the growth and expansion of ShelterBox and Rotary International's outreach as far as the disaster recovery and to help people long-term in their lives over the next 5, 10, 15 years? And we got to be quick.
Well, I think that we're going to continue to have great growth due to great Rotarians and volunteers and people who support our mission. And I'm really happy to be on the program and spread the word about ShelterBox, and hopefully this will help.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you for being with us, dear viewers, as we look around the globe as far as ShelterBox, Rotary International, and how we can reach into people's lives no matter where they are to help as we create the Emerald Planet.